1998 to 2014. Her work bridges ancient Indian historical texts and contemporary strategic studies. Dr. Kamal holds a graduate degree in history from Lady Shri Ram College and a postgraduate degree in international relations from JNU, New Delhi. She is a frequent speaker at leading defense institutions and contributes regularly to platforms like The Wire, The Print, and the MPIDSA. Her recent book, Kautilya's Arthashastra, Strategic Cultural Roots of India's Contemporary Statecraft, was published by Routledge in 2022. Today's session shall be chaired by Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, a veteran Indian diplomat who joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1967. Over the span of his illustrious career, he held several high-profile positions that spanned critical moments in Indian and global diplomacy. He specialized in Chinese studies and served in Beijing, Yugoslavia, Algeria, Afghanistan, Malaysia, China, and Pakistan. As Joint Secretary, East Asia, in the Ministry of External Affairs, he played a key role in Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's 1988 China visit. Ambassador Nambiar was India's permanent
Keep it
representative to the
slightly
United
short.
Nations.
You can keep it slightly short because it's the speaker whom you should concentrate on. Okay, go ahead.
All right, I'll just wrap it up quickly. Deputy National Security Advisor. Post-retirement, he was a special advisor to Kofi Annan and chef de cabinet to Ban Ki-moon. He also contributed as an advisor on Myanmar, leveraging his geopolitical expertise. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants will be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during this interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Ambassador Nambiar.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Govind. Thank you for inviting me to this session. This promises to be a very stimulating session. As you've already introduced the main speaker, Dr. Kajri Kamal is a distinguished scholar, an accomplished strategic analyst, and as I'm aware, an articulate speaker and an acute thinker. Now, these are more than enough attributes for a very, very interesting discussion that promises to be offered to us today. The subject is ancient statecraft and contemporary soft power. Sun Tzu and Kautilya and Sun Tzu. Now, Sun Tzu and Kautilya are symbols of the strategic culture of their respective countries and, in a sense, civilisational icons. As you said, these are timeless figures, and their relevance have continued over the centuries. While Chanakya or Kautilya's spread has been over statecraft as a whole, Sun Tzu's focus has been on Pingfa, or is it the art of war? But essentially, it has also been equally broad and expansive. And while the core object of both Kautilya and Sun Tzu is to provide for the leader or the ruler of a country definitive superiority or hegemony, as it were, over an adversary, there are various ways in which it is being done. It would be done in particular situations, ranging from the practical to, in some ways, the esoteric. Now, the person in engaging in this kind of a struggle, as it were, for what in parts of UP you call varchasva, which is, in a sense, establishing the advantage, can be done in various ways. And besides the fact that there are specific ways of doing it, there is the larger aspect of the normative background, the ethical background, etc., which both countries represent in a big measure, and which India describes as dharma, where in the case of China, there have been Confucian sort of values, etc., which also is layered. And as I think in both cases, it is, in a sense, moves from the very practical, the very simple, to greater and greater sort of levels of, let's say, compellence. Now, both emphasized the importance of self-knowledge knowing the enemy, knowing yourself, resilience, persistence, and the question of offense, violence being, as it were, a last resort and to be left to the minimum. And in some ways, it is interesting that both lived in an era where it was felt that the people should be brought in accord with their ruler. While the welfare of the people was obviously a very important aspect, but it was, as it were, the vision was from the viewpoint of the ruler rather than, in some ways, it was more the ruler-centric in that sense. Over the years, of course, the context has changed, and today's landscape is so completely different. Let me give you just put in context what Kadri will be mentioning, and that is we live today in a globalized world, interconnected, more transparent. Technology is leapfrogged. More than just the state is, there are non-state actors also very, very active, and there is, in a sense, an information technology landscape which actually very often provides a free-for-all for everything. Now, how do leaders, how do governments operate in this landscape? And that is where the concept of soft power comes in, apart from hard power, which has to be a rounded, more broad thing. The whole question as Kadri has mentioned, it is a Western concept, soft power, Joseph Nye, etc. Fine. But I think in Eastern thinking also, I think this is all obviously also catered for. This is in China, for example, they talk about setting the narrative or discourse power, which is an important factor or an important aspect of setting, to set the frame, as it were, of how people will discuss developments in your sort of context in terms of how you want to move the narrative forward. This is also, in a sense, setting up what you call discursive frames. More and more, when the dialogue, the discourse is used, is actually there are so many people who are engaging in this dialogue, in this discussion from all sides, not just within a country. Today's information explosion has provided everybody an opportunity to put his own little, and very often the people who have more powerful ways of influencing the information, sort of the area, the information landscape, they tend to have more power. It's not just that. What is the need? To what end is all this? Is this narrative power, this discourse power used? It is to establish the credibility, the legitimacy, predictability, and the vision of a state, and build trust within society, some kind of be able to work for continuity or for building change, depending on which is the priority at any particular stage. At the same time, there has to be trust and a kind of the credibility and of the government, of the regime, has to be maintained. Now, this is the broad aspect of how today's soft power should be exercised, is being exercised, and would ideally be exercised. Now, I don't have much more to say at this stage. I think I should straight away ask Kadri to start. I understand she has a PowerPoint presentation to make. The floor is yours, Dr. Kamal.
Thank you so much, Master Nambiar. I'll just take a second to have my slides up.
Yeah.
So Govind, can you confirm you can see my slides in a slideshow mode and I'm audible, loud and clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
You're audible and clear. Lights are visible.
Respected Chair, Master Nambiar, Professor Acharya in the audience, and all those who have joined virtually, a very good afternoon. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Institute of Chinese Studies for inviting me for this Wednesday seminar and giving me this opportunity, which I think is really to popularize Kautilya, but I'm going to be looking at the ancient strategies of Kautilya and Sun Tzu from a contemporary soft power perspective. The topic suggests, and that's exactly what I'm going to do, I will be examining the contemporary understanding of soft power, which we understand as getting someone to do something without the use of coercion, in ancient strategies of Kautilya and Sun Tzu. So basically, what did Kautilya and Sun Tzu say in their understanding of ancient strategy, which would lead people to do something without the use of coercion? And then juxtapose it with the modern conceptualization of soft power by Joseph Nye in a post-Cold War US context, and hopefully bring out some of the convergences and divergences. The second larger objective that I have for my talk today, which flows from the first, is that if there is a characteristic difference in the way the ancient avatar of soft power understands this whole process of attraction than its modern avatar, then how well do these two countries, China and India, employ them, implement them, conduct themselves? As far as China is concerned, we do have China invoking Sun Tzu more for its military approach, cautious war, how not to fight an enemy, how to win an enemy without fighting, which I think is more force-fitted and rhetorical, but do not end up invoking Sun Tzu in what I think is a more attractive soft power initiative on the part of China, which is the use of its economic instruments to gain influence. India, on the other hand, does not use Kautilya as an asset of soft power. At least it's not there in the official discourse of soft power in India today, either rhetorically, or in practice. So with that backdrop and a brief preview of what this talk is going to hold for you all, I will proceed and give you a brief agenda for the talk today. So I will very briefly go over the concept of soft power by Joseph Nye to begin with. I will then look at China's soft power, where I look at the postulated soft power assets of China, and this is by both Chinese and other scholars. I will trace the trajectory of China's soft power post-1990 and how it has really evolved to the present day, and how Sun Tzu has been referenced as an asset of soft power in this soft power discourse of China. Thereafter, I will present the postulated soft power assets of India, and I'll argue my case that there is an absence of Kautilya there, and therefore I would then look into Kautilya and his treatise, the Arthashastra, as the strategic foundations of India's soft power. And that's where I'm going to look at the concept of power in general in the Arthashastra and soft power in particular. I'll end with a reality check as to where India and China stand on soft power indices today, and on what parameters is China ahead of India, and perhaps why, possibly, potentially why. And I will end with a concluding slide with 3 major conclusions. Okay. Let's begin with the brief overview of soft power by Joseph Nye. Now, in very simple terms, for Joseph Nye, you could get someone to do something by either coercion, payments, or attraction. Attraction, persuasion, right? He even calls it traction. So soft power for him is the ability to obtain preferred outcomes by attraction rather than coercion or payment. This was in his book, Bound to Leap, in the year 1990, and thereafter he built this concept. And in 2003, because he thought the concept of soft power was being misunderstood, he really came up to firm up his thesis on soft power, saying that soft power alone is not sufficient. It may create an enabling environment, and that you do need a mix of both hard and soft power to get things done. Now, who decides how much of hard and soft power? For him, it is based on contextual intelligence, which he describes as the intuitive diagnostic skill of policy makers. Right? I'm highlighting these points because I'm going to pick up on all these when I present the case of the ancient strategies. So if you look at the spectrum on which Joseph Nye plots soft power, At one end is the command power, which is the hard power. And there he puts both coercion and inducements, which is payments, as part of hard power. And then agenda setting and attraction as part of soft power, the other end being co-option. And really the sources that we're going to be concentrating on today for this talk are the values, culture, and policies that Joseph Nye talks about. Let's look at China's soft power, and let's look at the postulated soft power assets in exactly these three verticals, which is culture. What is the attractiveness of Chinese culture? What are the values that they uphold? And what is the policies, foreign policy measures that they've adopted, especially when they're seen as legitimate? And as I said, I've got inputs from both Chinese and other scholars. So you see a lot of mix of things here. I'm not claiming this is an exhaustive list of soft power assets. It's just representative. But I'd just like you to notice here that as part of pure attraction in terms of culture, traditional culture is, of course, one of the pivots, but there are a whole lot of other pivots which actually belong to contemporary China's political ideology, technological prowess, work ethic, etc., etc. Among the values, yes, you do have the Confucian values, which Ambassador Nambiar alluded to in his introductory remarks, but you also do see a cautious war and harmony without suppressing differences, etc., etc. Among the policy measures, you do see a lot of foreign policy measures, aid infrastructure, participation in multilateral organizations, economic public diplomacy, use of broadcasting, as Ambassador Nambiar said, the discourse power. There's a lot of money which is pumped into media, both internal and in the interstate realm. But very important to notice here that there's a lot of poverty alleviation, economic governance also, being positioned when it comes to policy. So there's a lot of focus on the internal dynamics in China as part of its soft power asset, much more than any other country. If one was to trace the trajectory of China's soft power, and of course, again, this is really, a quick snapshot of it. If you begin with the decade of the 1990s, that's really where the term soft power was coined. We do see a number of academic writings stressing the need to strengthen soft power in China, right? And you have a spate of articles. In fact, there's a quantitative study done which actually says that there was soft power discussed in more number of articles in China than there were in the United States. And soft power in this era, the first decade, the last decade of the last century, was really seen as national development strategy. So the audience of China's soft power discourse, at least in the initial decade, was the domestic audience to begin with largely, right? But soft power, of course, was also in terms of foreign policy, in terms of China's own economic development, and wanting to get accepted in the international society. So you needed to, national integration, you needed to bind the people together through this common culture and then project a certain image of China abroad so that there was greater acceptance of it. The next decade, and I take 2000 to 2010 roughly here, you do see a more universal claim to strengthen soft power as well as hard power. And I have, the quote by Hu Jintao, who in a Central Foreign Affairs Leadership Group meeting said in the year 2006 that the increase in our nation's international status and influence will have to be demonstrated in hard power such as economy, science, and technology, and defense, as well as in soft power such as culture. Right, so you do see the official discourse talk more and more of soft power, but it was essentially one as a response to the American China threat theory, which the Chinese thought was, monopolizing the media outlets. So it wanted to position itself as an alternative. The Beijing consensus or the China development model really fits in here, that, you're trying to posit a development model which is different from the Washington consensus, but then pivots on sustainability, equality, innovation, self-determination, and foreign policy. And the other leg of this decade was essentially to for the narrative, to back China's peaceful rise. To begin with, it was rise, later, of course, changed to development. And you see that this was essentially to back a certain pivot in China's foreign policy, pivot from being American-centered to that of centered to its own neighborhood, pivot from diplomatic strategies to actually assuming larger global leadership and responsibility roles, and also pivot to not just economic development, but a whole overall comprehensive development of national power. Right? And through these 2 decades, you see the figures that are being invoked, the icons of Chinese culture are essentially Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, because it really serves and feeds the narrative very well, in terms of how to live peacefully with your neighborhood, how to provide them safety, prosperity, the whole idea of world peace and harmony, the idea of benevolent governance, right? So all that was picked up from the cultural wellspring of ideas and, made to sound like a coherent narrative. Post 2010, this is where, of course, we also have Xi Jinping coming in. And in Xi Jinping's own words, soft power was supposed to be used for a good Chinese narrative and to better communicate China's messages to the world. And this is where the bulk of what I think is actual China's soft power in action came about in terms of its economic engagements, partnerships, trade diplomacy, aid infrastructure. This is where you really have the coming in of the BRI, the RCEP, AIIB. It's China's outreach to its neighborhood, Asia, Europe, Africa, Latin America, etc., etc. But interestingly, in this time period, we also see a subtle invocation of Sun Tzu, Sun Tzu's Art of War. And the traditional military figure picked up from China's cultural heritage is Sun Tzu for backing its narrative. In the year 2014, it was done briefly, but in the year... Am I audible, sir?
There's a slight bit of you're breaking up a little bit, but please, I think it's now come back. Come along.
Okay, so should I continue?
Yes.
Okay. Oh. So the idea of invoking Sun Tzu as a traditional military figure to back China's narrative in this decade and after, which is post-2010, was essentially done briefly in 2014 and then later more persuasively in the years after 2022 with the launch of what Xi Jinping calls the Global Security Initiative, right? I'm going to look at the Global Security Initiative in particular because that's really when I see a lot of writings connecting what China is doing today with this military historical figure, Sun Tzu. Now, what is the GSI? It's the Global Security Initiative, which Xi Jinping announced or proposed at the Power Forum for Asia in 2022. Before that, in 2020, he announced the Global Development Initiative, and later he announced the Global Civilization Initiative. Where does it emanate from? It emanates from Chinese security infrastructure needs a revision, and that the US-led alliance architecture is actually, extremely destabilizing. It's exclusive, it's zero-sum, and therefore needs to be replaced. Right? So this is an initiative really positing itself as an alternative to that, and therefore then you see terms like, and this is the objective which I've taken from the concept paper of the GSI, claiming that the GSI seeks to eliminate the root causes of international conflicts, more stability and certainty, promoting durable peace, etc. This comes on the heels of the Russia-Ukraine war, right? So 2022, that is when it began. This is in April 2022. Now, for any layperson who has read certain broader principles of the GSI, but having said that, the GSI concept paper is absolutely bereft of any reference to any historical military figure from Chinese history, right? So my sense is that to say that China is for global, is China's foreign policy is aimed at global peace, is aimed at conflict resolution, may be slightly unreal or rhetorical, but the convergence has really been drawn to Sun Tzu's Art of War, and you can see that through a number of articles coming out in the state-owned media post the announcement of the GSI. So essentially, they say that Sun Tzu is all about how to win an enemy without fighting, the whole cautious war syndrome, that and how modern global challenges can actually be tackled. If we leverage the wisdom coming out from this ancient text. There are a number of academic writers, Art of War and the GSI also in general. To begin with, Joseph Nye himself in the year 2008 said that to be a soft power of attraction as well as the hard power of coercion. Interestingly, China, and this is when I say China, it is the China Research Society, as well as the Academy of Military Sciences of the PLA, which organized this set of symposia, which happened, the difference of 10 years. So 2014 was the first symposium, followed by 2024, where Sun Tzu was discussed. There were people called from all around the globe. For instance, the one in 2024 actually had 350 representatives coming from 30 different regions to discuss the wisdom coming out from Sun Tzu. And you actually have, if you read the media reports, you have people from Poland, people from Sun Tzu quote, and why they think it continues to be relevant. The head of the Academy of Military Sciences of the PLA actually thinks that the Sun Tzu's Art of War and Mutual Learning Among Civilizations, which was the theme of the International Symposium in 2024, actually practices President Xi Jinping's concept of a community with a shared future for mankind and implements the GDI, GSI, and GCI. Right? So while there is no mention of Sun Tzu in the official discourse in that sense, and the general usage of this ancient treatise and its strategy to resolve the conflictual environment in contemporary geopolitics. Now, to a naked eye, yes, there are certain convergences. Yes, you can say, okay, the GSI could be pulled from a strategy of Sun Tzu, but to me, it sounds rather, unreal. And if we were then to look at the idea of soft power in Sun Tzu, and if you were to look at this dictum, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And if you think this is really the dictum of soft power coming from Sun Tzu, then China is actually practicing soft power through use of its economic instruments, through trade and investment, through development cooperation, through regional international economic security initiatives, through technology transfer. Now, ironically, I don't know if it's advertent, inadvertent, one never knows when it comes to China, this aspect of what China does has not for some reason been attributed to soft power coming from Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu has only been referenced to in the context of, let's come to India. India, in terms of culture, values, policy, are these, again, not exhaustive, but representative. And the difference that you see from the ones that we put together for China is that when it comes to culture, the pure attraction are largely from the ancient world. Right, so Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the concept of intellectual dialogue, peaceful spread of ideas, spiritualism, ecumenism, which has been recently added, if you've read Patrick Oliver's book, etc. Values, all practicing today, but of course can be traced back to the ancient times, democracy, non-violence, pluralism, and a number of foreign policy measures, which of course also include economic diplomacy, economic engagements, global assistance, etc., etc. but very little of what the Chinese would call the economic miracle in their case. Right? What you see here is that Kautilya or the Arthashastra is really conspicuous by its absence. Right? And there are two reasons why I think this could be the case. One is the genuine lack of knowledge of the text itself among the people in general and the decision makers, both. There's very, very little that people know in terms of the fundamentals of statecraft that Kautilya professes. And the other being that there is a certain Machiavellian tag attached to Kautilya, which of course is also extremely ironical because Kautilya predated Machiavelli. And if anything, Machiavelli is the Italian Kautilya rather than the other way around. Now, with this backdrop, I would like to foray into what I think are the strategic foundations of India's soft power. And I, of course, argue that they remain untapped. So let me begin with a brief introduction of what the Arthashastra is. It is an ancient Indian theoretical treatise. And I say theoretical for a reason. It was not meant for any time period. It doesn't really talk about any strategic context. In fact, it's meant to be a philosophical classic and therefore is not a historiographical account. There is a lot of debate and discussion about who Kautilya was, whether he's the sole author or there are multiple authors. Which year do you argue that the compositional history of the text really dates back to the modern period? And that Kautilya and Chanakya are the same people. Chanakya coming from his father Chanaka, Kautilya from the Gotra to which he belonged, and Vishnugupta being his first name. Now, what I'm going to do briefly here is look at the conception of power in Arthashastra. And I'm going to just look at 4 vectors here. I'm not going to give you an expansive account of the conception of power in Arthashastra. So I'm going to look at this concept of power for what? So what does Arthashastra argue for? What are the components of power? So there's yoga kshema, which is the political end goal of the treatise, which essentially will give you an idea of power for what? Saptanga, which is Sapta Ang, 7 organs of the body politic, which is the comprehensive national power for state. So what are the components of power for Kautilya? Upay, Sam, Dan, Bhed, Dand, right? Yeah. So what is a stream where the bulk of our discussion on soft power really rests? And this idea of Dharma Vijay or, just use of force has a very soft underpinning to it, right? So let's begin with Yogakshema. Yogakshema essentially translates to providing for the people security and welfare. Now, remember, when we talk about the Arthashastra, we're talking about a monarchical form of government. So there is a ruler or the Swami. I'm going to use a simple mechanism to tell you the framework of statecraft in the Arthashastra. So the ruler, who is the monarch, who is the Swami, his primary duty is to acquire, protect, augment, and consolidate land. Right? Why land? Because land provided livelihood to his people. 2,300 years ago, which is presumably the time the text was written, all means of gainful economic production emanated from land, be it agriculture, cattle rearing, forest produce, mining, right? And all that the people were concerned with, given human nature being selfishly predisposed, they needed their roti, kapda, makan. They needed their physiological needs to be met. And that is what was primary duty of the ruler. And because they were provided with the livelihood, they lent legitimacy to the monarch, which is extremely critical for a monarchy to run effectively. And they also paid taxes to the state treasury, which is called kosh, right? Because the state treasury had funds coming from the people, the armed might or the rod was strengthened, because of which the ruler was able to curb matsirya, which is the law of the fish. Essentially, in the absence of a central authority, the big fish eats the small fish. It helps curb matsirya in the domestic realm and strengthens the rod with which the ruler acquires, protects, augments land in the interstate realm, which remains anarchic. So through a loop of all these activities, Kautilya ends up achieving raksha, which is security, and palan, which is welfare for its people. Now, 2 important takeaways here on this slide. One, that Raksha and Palan are interconnected. So only when you have security can you provide land to your people, can you have welfare. And only when you have welfare, when the people are well fed, will they pay taxes and lend legitimacy to the ruler, can you have security, right? So in the act of being rational and realist, which is acquiring land, protecting land, conquering land, augmenting land, you also concomitantly are being ethical normative. And therefore, then, for Kautilya and his genre of statecraft, there is no distinction between pursuing your values and pursuing your interests, because your values are to pursue your interests. Because only when you pursue your interests and you get more land, can you give more sources of or avenues of production to the people for them to be happy, for them to give back legitimacy to you. Right? So that is one aspect. And the second, you must appreciate the interconnectedness between the domestic and the interstate realm. That unless you have a happy set of people in the domestic realm, Ambassador Nambiar also mentioned that in the context of soft power in China, China did the right thing. It wanted to first get its people together before it could really project its soft power to the outside world. You need the people internal security is more important than external security, even before you took a foreign policy action, right? So those are the two themes here. What are the components of power? Very interesting. So if you look at the Western understanding of power, it's very different. For Kautilya, there are exactly 7 components of state power. They are put in a hierarchical order. Because it's a monarchical form of government, the Swami is on top, he's the head, and each of these correspond to a body part, incidentally. Logical components. There is a generative principle between them, which means that the Swami appoints the Amatya, the Amatyas are the ministers or the council of ministers. They make sure that the undertakings in the Janpad, which is territory and people together, are successful, because of which there is a certain defensiveness. So the fourth cities can be well defended, because of which the treasuries are flush with funds, because of which the army is well skilled, because of which your reliance on the external state factor is reduced, is made redundant, or the bargaining power with which you interact with the ally in the interstate realm is strengthened. So essentially, if you see, there's first 6 are internal state factors, and the last is an external state factor. Definitely, Durga comes before Dand. So you protect your capital city even before you set foot out to conquer. Right? So defense preferable to offense. And the inclusion of Mitra as the last resort shows, of course, of contemporary strategic vocabulary of to external balancing. But when your internal components are not optimized to help you achieve your political end goals, then you will rely on the external ally. And this just shows that the dependence on the ally or cooperation with the ally is not just possible, but even beneficial at times, right? Again, keeping in mind the contemporary geopolitical context. Now, what are the upayas? What is the strategy that Kautilya advises in terms of getting your political interest through, or making sure your adversary or ally does what you want it to do? And for Kautilya, there is no difference as such between hard and soft power. They are not watertight compartments. For Kautilya, upayas really is a power continuum. And the 4 things that he plots on this power continuum is Dand on one hand, which is very similar to what Joseph Nye conceives of as in terms of punishment, coercion, and which includes killing, tormenting, seizure of property, etc. Adds bhed to it, which of course has not been conceptualized, which is causing dissension. And these 2 he clubs as being repressive. And the other 2, which is dan, which is akin to carrots or payments in the Joseph Nye concept, and sam, which is conciliation. Now he clubs sam and dan as being remedial, and bhed and dan being repressive. Now I want you to note here that this part of conciliation, of getting someone to do what you would want it to do without the use of coercion, is really sam and dan. And I want you to pay attention to the 5-fold ways in which you can get someone to do what you wanted to do based on the Arthashastra. The first is praising of merits, which is, I say, and merits may or may not exist, so it's more rhetorical. I say that you're good at this and you've really taken care of your people. Adulation, praise. The second is mention of relationship. So you may have a common friend, you may be bound together by some relationship, etc., etc. So you mention relationship. Barring these two, which are more rhetorical, the next three are hardcore economic allurements on the ground. So he says, pointing mutual benefits in joint connectivity infrastructure projects, mutual benefits in trade deals, etc., etc. Something that benefits my party and also your party. Showing advantages in the future, which are essentially investment deals, investment for future common prosperity and security. And the last being placing oneself at the other's disposal, which translates to that whatever resources I have is also yours, be free to use it. Sam is usually combined with dan, which also is, unilateral benevolence, if I can put it. What is taken, received, you're basically being nice and intentionally so. So the point I'm trying to make here is that Joseph Nye's understanding of the attraction of culture from Harvard to Hollywood, and in India we've adapted it to Buddha to Bollywood, is really not going to gain you anything. That is not the soft power you should be chasing. The soft power you should be chasing are pure economic benefits that you can provide to your neighborhood and beyond to get them to legitimize your own foreign policy action and to be on your side. And therefore, tangible mutual benefits, shadow of the future, and resource sharing are key to. So while yes, mentioning common relationship, being nice, talking nice, polite words are important, but they're not sufficient. And to be really remedial. And this is really where the contextual intelligence that Joseph Nye talks about has been thought of by Kautilya. So he says that while there is this power continuum, but how do you decide what is the right mix of power? How much of Sam and Dan, how much of Ved and Dan, and it's of course a whole book on the training of the ruler and his in order to take right decisions based on, of course, information, intelligence network, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into that domain. But the point here is that you can use it exclusively as just Sam, as just Dan, as just Ved, and just Dand in that order, Dand being force as the last resort. Right? Or alternative, that is, you use Sam and Dan, and if it does not evoke the kind of response you want from your adversary, you go to Ved and Dan, you threaten him. But you come back to Sam and Dan, and the second time that you come to Sam and Dan, it will be more effective because of your show of force, threat of the use of force. And the most potent for Kautilya is a combination of the use of the 4 upayas, which is Sam, Dan, Ved, Dand, deployed simultaneously. That is soft power, but if you look at the understanding of use of force in the Arthashastra is also extremely just. So you see here is a statue of Chandragupta Maurya. He is the emperor of the biggest empire of its time. He's holding a book in his left hand, which is constant learner. So he needs to constantly update himself, immerse himself in learning. And he's holding a gada in his right hand pointed downwards, which is a very subtle show of the use of force, that I do have the supreme executive powers, monopoly of the use of force, but I'm going to use it only when it is required. So Kautilya says, for the king severe with the rod becomes a source of terror, the king mild with the rod is despised, and the king just with the rod is honored. And what is that justness? The justness is the use of force in the right manner, at the right time, with the right calibration, and with the right ramifications, with the right outcomes. So just ad bellum, just in bello, just post bellum, all have been very thoroughly conceived of in the Arthashastra. We know for a fact that use of force is the last resort, and it's not because of benevolence, it's not because of pacifism, but it's because of hardcore realism. Because for Kautilya, wars cause shay, which is losses, vyay, which is expenses, and pravas, which is demoralization of when they engaged in law, is selected through a very just way. He says it's better to attack a strong but illegitimate king rather than a weak and legitimate one. And this points to two, that you are very just in terms of your target that you choose, but also that if your domestic legitimacy is shaky, you would be the target of attack. So domestic legitimacy is extremely important. Internal security is extremely important. And of course, the fact that he differentiates between different kinds of victory, dharma vijay, lobh vijay, asur vijay, dharma, righteous victory, lobh vijay is greedy victory, where, you know, the victor really takes the wealth away, and asur vijay, which is demonical victory, where the harassment and havoc. Okay, so with that foray into ancient Indian strategy, let's do a quick reality check as to where we stand. And if you look at the power indices, and a backdrop to this slide here is that Joseph Nye, when he conceived of this concept of soft power in the year 2006, I think he said that India, with its democratic constitution, another scholar, Christian Wagner, 2008, he says that compared to China, India is a default soft power. So if really soft power came from the sheer attractiveness of a culture, there would be no other country greater than that of India. But the power indices don't say so. If you look at, and I've triangulated this, there's one Lowy Institute, which is Australia, there's another from Britain, the Pew survey of 2024 Global Attitude Survey, you see China topping the ranks. There's a huge difference between India and China, even in the Asian region. But if you just, go into the granular details of why China figures higher on soft power indices, you will figure out that the economic relationships, if you look at the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index of 2024, India is 10th as compared to China in terms of economic relationships. And the difference is between 98.1 and 17.5. If you look at the Global Attitude Survey of the Pew in the spring of 2024, of the 47% middle-income countries surveyed, they said China had a positive economic influence. So, I mean, the sense that you get is that just by having pure attraction is not going to get you anywhere. You need to, leverage that and, bring more tangible, benefits to the people you're trying to weigh over. Now, I'll conclude with just 3 remarks. One, that I do not see any, any scholarship in this whole terminology of soft power by Joseph Nye. I don't think this conceptualization really makes any sense, especially when you have an understanding of ancient strategies, both of China and India. And that even to back that soft power, you do need the hard power. There's an article, I think, written by David Shamborg in the year 2016 that China really has the greatest asset to project soft power, and he says it's money, right? So get real. I mean, that's really how the world operates. Ancient strategy tells us that real persuasion lies in creating mutually beneficial economic environments and security networks. And there is a sutra in the Arthashastra which says that if you want to overcome small, weaker, subjugated kingdoms, you will have to perform sam and dan, you will have to take care of their safety and security and prosperity. And that culture projection of intangible assets, Buddha, Swami Vivekananda, is important to a certain extent. It's definitely not sufficient or potent or efficient. And this is to really bring back Master Nambiar's point that we do need a knowledge narrative. And I think that India's default soft power needs to be projected through a credible, coherent knowledge narrative, which I think is provided most credibly by this very, very underrated, underread, under-researched treatise, which is the Arthashastra. That's all I have as part of my presentation. I'll be happy to take comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Kadri. That has been quite a tour de force, really, because you managed to get both Sun Tzu and Kautilya placed right in the middle of your soft power discourse, as it were. And in some ways, you have actually, the Chinese have an expression, prettify. You have in some ways prettified both these, let's say, big iconic figures by putting them in a wholly, of course, it's by and large fair. I'm not saying it's unfair, but there are some of the, for example, when you talked about the upayas, you didn't talk about bribery and corruption, which is an important aspect of how to subdue others. Now that, in fact, I think to some extent that has been, it's part of virtually every political culture in the world. I wouldn't think that it's this thing. And in some ways, persuasion, it's not persuasion, it's actually building, you called it dan, and some people call it dharma also. It's not just dan. The second thing which you have not mentioned is deception, indirection, people pointing people to the wrong way, which is done as a matter of specific tactic, strategy, in some ways also damning with faint praise, as it were, is also another. These are things which are used, and I don't know if in some ways it's to get the enemy unprepared. And the third point which I need to make is, even when you talk about the best, the most significant statement in Sun Tzu is to subdue the enemy without fighting a war. That may be true, but the fact is, it is still the enemy and is still subduing him. Now, those two things are very important, because when you talk about soft power and in discourse, you are talking in terms of as if there is no enemy. The subtext in all this is really your adversary. Identify clearly your adversary, and you must subdue him. He must in a sense be. So however much you may praise somebody, the fact is ultimately he has to be within your control. That is the end, as the bottom line in both, I think, in both Sun Tzu and Arthashastra. I don't know if you agree with me entirely.
No, absolutely, Master Nambiar. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the point of deception, because for even those who have very little knowledge of the treatise, actually think the Arthashastra is all about deception. It's all about, subterfuge. It's all about disinformation, misinformation, right? But interestingly, the Arthashastra brings in the understanding of deception only when he talks about warfare. And that is why deception is such a key figure in Sun Tzu's Art of War, because that is really a manual for the general on the battlefield, not a book on good governance. Arthashastra is a book on good governance, where warfare is just one of the cogs in the entire machine. So when he does talk about warfare and different types of warfare, he talks about Prakash Yudh, which is conventional war, where you decide that the two parties are going to go to war and you sound each other. The second is actually Koot Yudh, where you fight a war with an enemy which is stronger than you, and therefore you devolve your military methods in a way, of course, around deception, to be able to overcome them. And then there is Tusnim Yudh, which is silent war. So this hybridity in warfare, which is also associated with Sun Tzu, is very much part of the Arthashastra as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Now we can pick, I think there must be quite a few questions.
Yes. So there are some questions. I'll read it out to them. So first question is by Mr. Rajkumar. He says, does Indian Foreign Service have institutionalized Kautilyan strategic culture as a strategic vision for modern India, although having articulated by Ambassador Shivshankar Menon and Ambassador Sham Saran in the past as analyzed and articulated by you previously? And if not institutionalized by Indian Foreign Service, then what would be the way forward?
Well, there is some information, but I'm not sure, since this is being broadcast. if I can share that. So I wouldn't know how to answer this. Let me tell you that they are on a surer path, and this will get institutionalized. It is already in the talks, will get institutionalized. It has the backing of the people who matter, and it's bound to happen soon.
With that very cryptic remark, I think we'll have to be satisfied with that for the present. Okay.
All right. So there is another question by Mr. Rajkumar. What are the similarities and differences between Kautilyan school of thought and Sun Tzu school of thought? And how can India leverage both school of thoughts for a successful Indian foreign policy, counter Chinese foreign policy?
Thank you for asking that question. So there are a number of articles that I could point out which really go into the scholarship of both Sun Tzu and Kautilya. But if I were to make a comparison and to give you a response which is quick, I see them as apples and oranges. I mean, having read Sun Tzu's 13 books and having read Kautilya's Arthashastra, there's absolutely no comparison. In the sense that, as I mentioned, Sun Tzu's Art of War is about the art of war, and the Arthashastra is about governance. It's about statecraft. It's a very, very comprehensive treatise, which is a magnum opus on grand strategy at one end, and yet fleshes out the most critical of details of military tactics on the other. And if anything, I'd rather lean towards grand strategic understanding than military tactics, for the simple reason that situation on the ground has changed. We actually, have new ways of conducting wars. But this idea of, using force as the last resort, not coming out of pacifism, but because of realism, saving your resources, trying to use other ways just short of a large conventional war, is something which is common to both these, civilizations. And while I do not see everything in the Arthashastra being panning out in India's conduct of foreign policy, I did, in my little research that I did for my talk today, figure out that the Chinese are actually digging into their ancient classics, and they're only bringing out those aspects of the ancient classics which will appeal to the international audience. Whereas so for instance, after the 20th Party Congress, we had the Central National Security Commission meeting, where Xi Jinping brought out this whole idea of extreme case thinking, bottom line thinking, extreme case thinking. Extreme case thinking is essentially pushing the enemy to the extent that you figure out what does he resort to last, so that you can calibrate your preparedness based on that. That's very much part of book 3 of Sun Tzu. That you try and gauge from the response of an adversary that you've pushed so hard to figure out what all the. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot in Sun Tzu's Art of War, which I think the Chinese have capitalized. There's even more in Kautilya's Arthashastra, which unfortunately lies untapped.
All right, thank you, ma'am.
You're on mute.
We have another question, which says, again Mr. Rajkumar. He says, does Kautilya and Sun Tzu have articulated religion as strategic leverage for soft power and hard power diplomacy, as most of USA-led West is doing from most of their history? And does India have some kind of strategic thinking to leverage Hinduism, Buddhism, and other religions?
I'm sorry, Govind, I lost you in between. Your voice was breaking up. So could you just repeat the question, or just the gist of it?
Using religion as strategic leverage.
Religion as a strategic leverage.
Yes,
is the question about how India uses religion as a strategic leverage?
The West uses it. He says, how does it make sense for have India to leverage Hinduism, Buddhism, and other religions?
Well, I think this argument again falls into the modern avatar of soft power. That is, just by sheer attraction, you can get people. I mean, the number of Americans converting to Hinduism has only grown exponentially in the past decade. But does that really mean the Americans will sign a trade deal with India which is beneficial for India and not for them? No. right? They'll perhaps come in and garland maybe a shivling of a temple. That maybe they can do that. But is it really going to translate into actions which have consequence in the realm of foreign policy? I'm not sure about that. So I know if that was the question, then this is my response to that.
I might add that in addition to the questions in the chat box, if somebody would like to use the raise hand option, that would be also useful. Make some comments or any questions. Is there anybody who would like to do that?
Sir, before that, there is one more question in the chat box. I'll read it out. So Miss Priyanka is thanking you for the presentation. She asks, is there any mention of how to deal with corruption in art of war as Xi Jinping is taking this drive since assuming office?
So I'm actually an expert on the Arthashastra, not so much on Sun Tzu, but I can give you an answer from an Arthashastra perspective, and I'll be very happy to do that. So Kautilya says that corruption is built in. So like a fish, you never know how much water it drinks while swimming. Same way, you don't know how much the bureaucrats are earning out of corruption when they're in the system. That's something which is given. That's something which they are predisposed to do, right? So all you can do is have your checks and balances. All you can do is have continuous, intelligence on them, your spy network, etc., etc. And you should be continually testing them based on loyalty, integrity, etc., etc. So this is something which is given. The political anthropology of the Arthashastra, which I think is also of Sun Tzu, is that human nature is selfishly predisposed, that left to themselves, the stronger will devour the weaker, and they will make money. They are greedy by nature, and that is something which is a given. You cannot, get rid of this. All you can do is, make sure that you have the right measures to arrest it to whatever extent is possible.
It's interesting you say that, because I'm not sure if the intellectual or the spiritual foundation of India, of Hinduism or Indian religions, is based on the human nature as being base rather than benign. Because even in Confucianism, Shinban Shan, as they say, it is true Shinban Shan, they say.
True.
People are basically good. So you have basing the postulate of Kautilya based on the inevitability of a corrupt approach, which is, it's interesting that you're saying this, because in fact there's another point which I think I'd like to make, in the absence of any raised hand, is there is much that is written on deception, yes, particularly in terms of tactics and in terms of military tactics, even diplomatic perhaps. But there is a difference between deception and deceit. That is, lies. And I think the credibility of all leaderships lies in it's being truthful, in the sense that not being caught lying, because the credibility of the leadership is in what it says is correct. You can suggest a whole lot of untruths, you can suppress a lot of truths, but you can't state an open lie. And as far as I know, that has been in the years that I have had the experience of even the media in China. It has been basically that it may suggest a lot of falsehoods, it may suppress a lot of truth, it may not tell you the whole truth, but I have not seen too many blatant lies. And today you are seeing a totally different world. You are seeing a world of fake news, you're seeing a world of lies, you're seeing a world of manufactured facts, and this is a completely different world. How do you think would a Kautilyan approach to this, what would be the Kautilyan approach to this kind of a situation?
So I'll answer this question first, sir, and then take up that human nature trajectory in both Chinese and ancient Indian civilizational history. For Kautilya, fake news. So if I were to imagine him in today's day and age, I know for a fact that he was completely convinced of the effectiveness of PR skills. So, for instance, when the state is instituted and the people for the first time are told to pay taxes to the state for the maintenance of the state, because that is one which is curbing Matsinyai for them and bringing out an orderly existence for them, they're obviously not willing to do it, right? You have to then give away a portion of what you've earned to the state, and that's not something which they would do willingly. So Kautilya actually has his PR agents, who are essentially spies, go and mingle with the people and tell them their stories, that our forefathers were, overwhelmed by the Matsinyai, and the king then, Vivaswat, so-and-so, said that I'm going to provide security and prosperity to you, and you need to give 1/6 of your grains, 1/10 of your commodities, and that'll bring about order. And they did that willingly, and that's why we've prospered. So spreading stories which will make the people think one with the state is something that Kautilya is completely for.
It is building a narrative.
Narrative, absolutely. So in fact, I keep saying this, that the biggest ode that we can give to Kautilya is build a narrative around the Arthashastra and sell it to the rest of the world. I mean, that, because, not everything in the Arthashastra is relevant. And he says that himself. The very first sutra says that it's a compilation of a previous Artha tradition. And he takes a previous Artha tradition and says that in today's day and age, this is valid, this is not valid, and we need to adapt. So the whole relevance of the Arthashastra is on its adaptiveness, and certain elements can be adapted and certain cannot, right? Coming to human nature, so, and this is, so I've started investigating ancient Chinese strategic culture, and I was reading Confucianism and how it's graduated to then the legalist school, Sun Tzu, etc., etc. And I realized that unlike the ancient Indian strategic trajectory, where there is no clear breakage or no clear dissonance with the past layer, it's a palimpsest, as Jawaharlal Nehru himself said, that each successive layer adds something new to the previous without erasing the baseline, right? And that's how it's happened. So you talk about human nature. The human nature is the same in the Mahabharata. It's the same in the Vedas. Matsinyai, the concept of Matsinyai is extremely ancient in the Indian context. Whereas if you look at the Chinese and if you look at Confucianism, it's all about virtuosity, virtuousness, about benevolence, about human nature being good, a virtuous man. But suddenly you have the legalists who say, no, man is not virtuous by existence. And he, needs to be schooled. He needs to be
Sorry, you're cutting. You're breaking up. I don't think we got the last point.
So there is so in the Chinese context, there are these ruptures in the trajectory of Chinese strategic culture.
Yes. Okay.
Whereas in the Indian context, you do see a build-up rather than a rupture.
Okay. Thank you. Is there any I don't know whether Govind, is there anything you can see?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one more question. So Mr. Rajkumar asks, what would be the Kautilyan way forward for India to manage her own strategic rise against China? And if India successfully beats China in longer term, then what would be the ultimate Indian foreign policy strategy to give a sole super fight to manage and partner USA for a multipolar world in long term?
That's a whole webinar in itself, I can trace the trajectory of India-China bilateral relations through the prism of relative strength from the 1990s to today. And where does the US fit in there? So I see India-China get into what Kautilya would call a Sandhi, which is the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement. So Sandhi is a pact of non-aggression. Both these countries got into them in the years 1993, 1996, because they were roughly co-equal powers. Relative strength is extremely important in understanding categories of states in the Rajamandala, which is the interstate realm conceptualized by Kautilya. But so they did it because they wanted to consolidate themselves, wanted to build their domestic capacities. And the next almost 2 decades, China did it much better than India did. So China rose to become what Kautilya would call the Madhyam, which is the bigger power in the Rajmandala. And that's when India tried to walk on 2 legs, which is, managing its convergences and divergences. But what happened in the summer of 2022, which is at the LAC, I see that as a policy shift from Sandhi to Yana. Yana is persuasive diplomacy, which China did. And Kautilya would reason it, saying that China did what it did because of one strategic advantage. It was asymmetrically more powerful than India. It had no reason to remain tied in a pact of non-aggression with India. And 2, very importantly, that you do break out from the pact of non-aggression, especially when there is asymmetry between the 2 powers, when the weaker power tries to fervently fill the gap. So the outcomes that you're expecting from the pact of non-aggression, being the stronger power, no longer remains relevant if the weaker power is trying to fill the gap. So resuscitation of Quad, leaning towards the United States, border road infrastructure development, etc., etc. There were no signals that India was sending that of a subjugated kingdom, right? And therefore, then India's response is limited between what Kautilya would call a foolhardy valor, so call China out an enemy and fight it, and spineless submission, that you should do neither and creatively use the space between these 2 extreme ends and live to fight another day.
Good.
I'm not sure if I was...
I think that was good enough. If I may ask you an unfair question, but nevertheless, as a Kautilyan, how would you, what kind of a Swami, as a Kautilyan, would you categorize Donald Trump as? And how would you evaluate his leadership in the current Trump 2?
I mean, to be fair to him, it's a very short period to make an assessment. But from what he's done and where he comes from, I think it will be a pure antithesis of how the Swami is conceived of, for the simple reason that the Swami is, in the Kautilyan context, supposed to be a Raj Rishi, a Rajarshi. And all his decisions have to be backed by sound data. They have to be one with the people's expectations, and they have to ultimately bring about the welfare and security of the people. So both in terms of intentions, both in terms of the actions, and in terms of the outcomes, I'm not sure if it really aligns with the Kautilyan Swami approach.
Okay, it's been I don't know if is there any more? Are there any more questions, Govind?
No, sir. No more questions.
I think it's been a fascinating conversation, or certainly a presentation made by you. And I think there's so much that has been left in some ways for us to be sort of just cogitating on in terms of what India needs to do in the current context. As you said, the absence of the Kautilyan kind of input into our soft power in a real way. We talk about yoga, we talk about Bollywood, we talk about various other things. And of course, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, you can actually integrate into Chanakya, I'm sure, or into Kautilya. But there is a lot that remains to be done. I will not try to sum up what you've just said. We have listened to an absolutely fascinating discussion on the conceptualization of soft power in the context of India and China, taking lessons, as it were, from both Sun Tzu and Kautilya. Thank you very much, Dr. Kajri Kamala, and total lovely conversation.
No, thank you so much, Ambassador Nambiar. In fact, it's been really inspiring to be in your company. We should have more of these. I'm not sure if it'd be at the behest of ICS, but we can definitely have more Zoom conversations. There's just so much to learn from you and your experience. And thank you so much for your very, very generous comments and engagement with my argument. I'd also like to thank the audience members, especially Rajkumar, for his multiple questions. I'm sure they didn't get answered well, and that's why you have to keep asking, and I'm sorry for that. But in my brief research that I did for this presentation, I'm completely overawed by the fact that China works so meticulously. I mean, even digging into their past is such a rich experience, even for an outsider. And that is really something that we need to learn from, which we need to integrate. Really, I mean, that's something which we need to take forward in the case of India. But I've, had a selfish reason here at this forum, and I must admit, at least at the end of it, that I really want to push the Kautilya word. And if anything, adding my bit to that narrative, which I hope will get built hopefully soon, because, with the power which is rising, which India is, and the agency that it's going to have subsequently, it needs to have a knowledge narrative. It needs to communicate what it is, where is it coming from, what are its antecedent traditions, and how might it behave in the interstate realm. For instance, I mean, when we talk about strategic autonomy, when we talk not about not wanting to bandwagon, not wanting to be the NATO ally, the kinds that US wants from us, it's very difficult to explain our position. But if the Americans know where Kautilya comes from, if the Americans know that we are not in for alliance partners which are stronger than us for the simple reason that we don't want to make ourselves vulnerable to the dictates of the stronger power, then perhaps they will understand our standpoint from a better perspective, and will probably have respect for that tradition. So we will have less convincing to do, if not fighting in the interstate realm, if we just develop this narrative. So on that note, I'd just like to thank the Institute of Chinese Studies, and especially Master Nambiar and Professor Acharya for the encouragement. And I hope to present another paper, at the same Wednesday seminar, whenever I'm ready with one or a different theme. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Govind, for being an excellent jockey.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I think we'll call it off at this time. Shall we, Govind?
Yes, sir. So with this, we come to the end of today's webinar. We thank, yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. We thank Dr. Kajri Kamal and Ambassador Nambiar for gracing today's session with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. The video of today's discussion will be available on ICS YouTube channel. We would like to invite you for the upcoming Wednesday seminar titled Growing Uncertainty in Existing International Order, whether India's relation.
Okay, couldn't hear you well. Okay.
Yeah, I think he's breaking up. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Whether relations, scheduled on 23rd of April. You may subscribe to our newsletter as well. Thank you for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen.